Yeah, so I'm going to talk about machine learning for clinical EEG. Today it's going to be a talk in two parts. So I'll start by talking about the academic work that's been done to date, and then move on to talk about ideas for how we might move that into clinical translation. Just to get a sense of people's background, how many people here work in machine learning? Okay, how many people work in EEG or have done some work with EEG? Okay, so a bit of a mix. Well, I'll start with the problem. Yeah, for those of you who haven't worked with the EEG, we're talking about the brain's electrical activity. You put electrodes on someone's head like this, and you can take a recording of the electrical activity, at least near the scalp, and it comes out looking like these squiggly lines. But some people are trained to interpret these squiggly lines, and you can make various useful inferences from those. It's used a lot in diagnosis and assessment of epilepsy, but also for a lot of other neurological conditions. And it's already established for use in clinical settings. There's a lot of research that suggests it has a lot of potential for broader use, for wider applications within those clinical settings. And in some cases it is recommended for wider use, but that doesn't necessarily happen. So the AAN, American Academy of Neurologists, I think, recommends having continuous EEG monitoring for all ICU patients with altered mental states. That doesn't happen in practice. There was a Canadian study that indicated it was happening about 30% of the time. And it's been acknowledged that a major factor in why it's not used as much as we think it should be used is the limited capacity, and particularly the human resource to deliver this service. And the time of the interpreter, the person who sits down and understands those squiggly lines and says what they all mean, can be about half the cost. So if we're looking at a 48-hour recording, then $251 out of $501 of the total cost for that EEG is the time for someone to look at it and interpret it. So naturally, people are thinking about what AI can do in this space. Can we accelerate how much an interpreter can do with their time, and in doing so, bring down the cost of delivering these services, but also maybe make it feasible to expand their use, to use them in wider settings like that ICU case that we talked about there. So as a very brief overview of the state of the art in the particular part of clinical EEG that I'm interested in today, the most sort of fundamental task when you get a routine clinical EEG is that after interpreting it, the person who's interpreted it in their sort of factual report, they have to say whether this EEG is normal or abnormal. And then, of course, if it's abnormal, they have to say why. But the most fundamental task is this binary classification problem. And there is one very widely used data set that's sort of reasonably accessible to a wide range of researchers, and that's this one from Temple University Hospital. There are some studies that use smaller data sets or data sets that aren't so widely accessible, but most of the work in this field is being done on this data set. And there's been this hypothesis for the last 4 or 5 years that for the task in general, we are hitting a performance ceiling for this task, that the accuracy can't really go beyond 90%. This 2024 study has, basically played with a lot of different configurations of neural networks, particularly convolutional neural networks they were focused on, and sort of showed that, when you vary the size, if you make them much, much bigger, it seems like your errors not quite reaching, in this case, 10%. And an explanation for that is that the humans who are providing the ground truth for this data only agree with each other about 90% of the time. So if your ground truth is only, if the humans agree with each other 90% of the time and your machines learn from the humans, then that machine's going to learn to agree with the humans about 90% of the time, or thereabouts. So that's proposed as this idea that this is a ceiling of the performance that we can expect in this task, at least as long as we are dependent on that particular ground truth. So yeah, I'll talk through a few bits of work that we've done in that area, and we'll come back to that performance ceiling idea. But yeah, one of the kind of start of this stream of work was just around increasing the availability of that data. As I said, there's this one data set that's very widely used, and probably the research community is overfitting to that data set in some sense, that the techniques we're developing might just, the ones that give the state-of-the-art performance on that data set, it might just be that they're particularly well suited to that data set rather than being, in general, the best. So we'd like to have more data available, but it's expensive to get nicely labeled data, as anyone who works in machine learning is probably familiar with. So this work in 2021, we just showed that we could automate the labeling, because the conventional practice is that the reports on these EEGs are stored as text, and as I said, the most fundamental part of that report is at the end they say whether it was normal or abnormal. So with certainly what is by the standards in the ChatGPT area, with very simple text processing, you can pick out those keywords and identify whether each recording is normal or abnormal, as long as you have those text reports, which are in sort of semi-structured language, so they're relatively easy to process. And so in this report, we showed, we took two different approaches: a very simple rule-based algorithm and also a convolutional neural network that was applied to the text to classify them as normal or abnormal. And we showed that with that, we could sort of label, if you have a large uncurated data set, we could label that automatically. So the available data from that big Temple University corpus goes from the 2,717 that had been manually labeled by their team up to 17,000 recordings. And yeah, we showed it didn't actually help in terms of this data set. Maybe we were still hitting that performance ceiling. We didn't show any substantial change in EEG classifier performance, but we did show that we could improve the ease in curation of new data sets as long as we can access that data, including the text reports. Then we can show that it would be relatively easy to access if we access a large data set, to curate it so that we have decent labels from that data set. So yeah, that's useful for the aim of enabling access to more data for this problem. But also along the way of looking at these labels a bit more closely and understanding what our models were doing compared with conventional practice. That kind of focus on that particular area was very helpful in steering us in a direction where we could make more useful process, because it honed our attention on what these labels are really all about, because that idea of the performance ceiling really breaks down when you look at how these labels are generated. So the labels that are on this data set are from consensus among a panel. They're not taken from the original reports in the way I suggested, even those reports are available, they got a fresh set of people to look at each recording and say if it's normal or abnormal based on what they see in the EEG. And because they were doing that, it was one panel doing that by consensus, then the inter-rater agreement problem doesn't really limit the accuracy within this data set, because even if that panel is not correct, they are at least in agreement with each other. So our machine can learn to agree with that panel, even if it's not learning the best possible answer to every question. In theory, it could learn to agree perfectly with what that panel tends to think. So we say that, for this particular data set, the performance ceiling does not apply, and I think that the ceiling is potentially 100%. Apart from that, the more that we thought about the labels, we focused on this idea that the labels apply to recordings, which for that data set, I think they tend to be about up to 20 minutes. I think they're all 15 to 20 minutes for their curated data set. And a lot of the kind of foundational work in deep learning in this area started around 2017, applying convolutional neural networks. And the common practice throughout that period has been to divide these recordings into smaller windows for the sake of training, because it means you don't need to have as large a model in order to take the full signal into scope. But it also means you get more training samples, because if you divide each recording into 20 windows, then you've got 20 times as many samples to train against in some sense. So this is a very widespread practice to divide these recordings into windows. But that means that each of your windows is inheriting its label from the parent recording. So we take a recording, and someone has looked at this whole signal and said, there's something abnormal here. We look at the recordings and we're saying, okay, all these windows are abnormal, but actually, for the kinds of abnormalities that you're often looking for in EEG, a lot of these windows will not have any clear evidence of abnormality. We could say maybe that's still an accurate label because it's from someone who was shown to be abnormal, and maybe a machine could learn to see that hidden abnormality in there, but quite possibly the abnormality is not in that window. So we could consider that a weak label. Maybe it confounds the machine learning process, that the machine won't train as effectively because it's getting confused when we tell it this window is abnormal, and it is not spotting the things that it thinks it's learning to be signs of abnormality. And so there's those two aspects of the labels for this data set and how they're sort of constructed that are quite key to breaking this performance ceiling hypothesis. And so we went on to break that ceiling in three different ways that I'll talk about on the next slides. But we've shown that the state-of-the-art performance, that we're not bound by that 90% limit, so that was the previous state-of-the-art, we can get to 99% on this data set. And I'll talk through these three different sort of techniques across the next slides, starting with this idea of multiple instance learning. So, as I said, the common practice is to divide these recordings into smaller windows for training, and we get these weak inherited labels. We can show analytically, I've got some derivations where we can show that in this situation, if the evidence of abnormality tends to be sparse, that we expect that normal recordings will look normal in every window, but abnormal recordings will look sometimes normal and sometimes abnormal. Those characteristics set up this bias where when you train a model in these circumstances, you're going to get lower sensitivity. And if we look at our table of the previous state of the art leading up to this technique, then we can see that sensitivity is always much lower than specificity for these models. So basically, it's this low sensitivity that is holding back their overall accuracy. And I think that low sensitivity comes from this, this problem of the weak inherited labels. And what we propose as a way to address that is to just have a second machine learning stage, because in conventional practice, you would have your recording divided into windows, and you would have your first stage model that provides a probability of abnormality for each of those windows, and then you need to aggregate those outputs for a per recording decision. And so the common approach for a long time has just been to do that by taking the mean, and it's something that in the sort of the seminal papers from this period, they tend to not even mention that. So I had to look into their code base to see how they were actually doing this aggregation. So I think it wasn't really considered as an important part of the overall performance. But once you think about this label inheritance problem, then we start to think it is quite an important part. So we thought, okay, let's just do some machine learning in that bit and optimize that aggregation decision. And so we did that in two stages. There's this first, the 2023 paper, where we were calling it scope and arbitration, and essentially by putting a simple MLP, traditional shallow neural network in there, we could get up to 93.3% accuracy, and we're seeing balance between our sensitivity and specificity there. So it's just about gone through that performance ceiling around 90%, and the benefit is in line with what we'd expect by improving sensitivity. So that was an initial conference paper on that, and now we have a preprint for an extended sort of journal paper where we've refined various subtleties of the technique along the way, and this is where we get to 99%. So for all the tricks that I'm showing today, I think that this is the one that makes the biggest difference in this case. And particularly, I was very impressed with what XGBoost does for us here. So if you're not familiar with XGBoost, it's a machine learning, the framework is almost more than an algorithm. It's a software package, essentially, that if you have tabular data in particular, the sort of data that sits in a table nicely, rather than sort of squiggly lines, if you've got data that sits in a table, XGBoost is just, in practice, really effective at learning to make good inferences from that data, because it's working on a very general problem. I think lots of people have been refining this software package for several years, and it's just become very good. So I think if you have tabular data, it makes sense to just throw XGBoost at it. And people would say neural networks are not good for tabular data. But the data that we have coming out of these windows, I would say, is essentially a table that we've got a column for each of our windows where we say the probability of abnormal coming out of that one. So it makes sense there to use XGBoost, and certainly in our case, there are a few other refinements in there, but XGBoost is doing most of the work, getting us from 93 to 99%. So yeah, if you've got some tabular data and you're wondering what to do with it, I'd say throw XGBoost at it. Yeah, so that kind of seemed too simple for how effective it was. It kind of come from common sense, and we called it, we're trying to come up with a name for it to kind of generalize it, and we were calling it scope and arbitration, and then calling it window stacking, and then realized that actually what we're talking about has been talked about as a more general problem before. And the keywords, if you want to look up this kind of technique in the literature, is multiple instance learning. I was talking about this general case where you have bags of samples where the evidence that you're looking for in each bag, you might have a few samples, some of which contain the evidence you're looking for and some of which don't, so you get that weak labeling problem. And multiple instance learning is the class of techniques that allow you to address that. And in hindsight, I realized that what we've created is a special case of multiple instance learning. It can be done as an end-to-end training process. In our case, we do it as two models, which gives some advantages of modularity, particularly because it makes it easy for us to stick XGBoost in there and let it do its magic. So that was I think a simple but powerful advancement. We've tried a couple of other tricks. This is work with my PhD student, Yixuan Zhu. He was interested in then focusing a bit more on that first stage model, the one that's just looking at each window and how we could optimize performance there. And he was interested in the idea of borrowing some architectures from domains that he was more familiar with before he started working on EEG with me. So he wanted to see what he could pull over from the world of audio classification and see how they help in this setting. Firstly, can we adapt some of the more well-established architectures there, because there's generally more work being done on audio classification than there is on EEG classification. So their domain is a bit more mature, so if we can borrow things, maybe that helps us skip ahead in our development cycles. So we tried out two architectures adapted from the audio domain, and also tried pre-training on big audio data sets to address the scarcity of EEG data we have here. Audio is quite different to EEG. We thought maybe there are some things in common that it's learned, worth a shot. I think, long story short, that didn't really help. But adopting these architectures does help. So when we look at the performance on the individual windows, comparing with, so Deep 4 is kind of the best established convolutional neural network for this problem. But when we try these other two architectures, then we see, even without that multiple instance learning approach, we're getting well above that 90% hypothesized performance ceiling there. So just having a better architecture helps a lot, and borrowing them from a field where they're further ahead than you seems, in this case, to have been helpful. The third thing that we've been looking at most recently is more of a multimodal approach, and in particular, we're talking about combining the EEG with, as I said, these reports tend to be stored in every hospital. You have the EEG, and you'll often have some video of that EEG recording being taken, but in almost every case, you'll have the report of the conditions under which the recording was taken, and what the conclusions drawn from that, what the observations were. So in that report text that is very widespread, there's some a posteriori information. There's the decisions, the observations, but there's some a priori information that just tells us something about the context of that recording. So things that the person interpreting the EEG would have known when they sat down to start interpreting it. So therefore, it's arguably fair game to use that in a classifier that, if we were handing some of this task over to AI, we could give it that contextual information before any human has actually looked at the EEG recording. There's a lot of nuance around that of, for when you're entrusting this task for a human, they might have that information but choose to ignore it, or try to choose to ignore it, like ignoring whether the person has a history of epilepsy. Whereas if we're using more of a black box machine learning approach, it's harder to tell it to ignore some of those things. But we looked at two approaches to integrate this a priori text information into an EEG classifier. So we get this kind of two towers architecture where we have, this is kind of like our old EEG module, and we've tacked in something to run in parallel with it to process the text, to extract features of interest from the text and then fuse them together with whatever has been extracted from the EEG before we make an overall prediction. So this is trained at, as one end-to-end training process. where it learns the three separate tasks of what to extract from EEG, what to extract from text, and how to combine those different modalities together. And this again was quite effective in, again, getting us well above this 90% mark. So yeah, we see, comparing with previous state of the art, that even with using the old sort of modules for the EEG side of this architecture, that when we add in particularly the text embeddings from using an LLM, then that information goes a long way to improving the performance that we can get out of the older EEG architectures. And if we combine it with the higher performing ones that we've seen, then we still get some incremental gain on top of that already high performance. So that's kind of three techniques that all seem to have been quite good at bringing performance on this problem, at least for this data set, higher than people thought it could go. Our emphasis in future work is to shift towards clinical translation, because, essentially, I think we've shown that it's good enough. We need to get more. We can't just keep banging our heads against this data set. I think we really need to get access to more data to validate how well these techniques generalize to other data, as well as to carry on with more development. I think we've used this more than how much we should, this particular one. There are some other data sets out there that have emerged in the last couple of years. There's a big one from Harvard, and also this NMT South Asian data set that is sort of similar in scale to the Temple one, which it's good to see those coming on the scene. For our purposes, they're not from NHS cohorts, and there's a limit in the ground truth quality that we get from them. So they don't come with the full reports that we saw in the other, the labeling that we had for our data set. We don't have that information there, and thinking more broadly, we've seen that a multimodal approach could be effective if we're looking at text, that there's other data modalities we would like to include, but none of those are included here. So the things that we would like to do with EEG would require more than just the conventionally available data sets. Linking more data together will, I think, is very likely to enable further performance gains. So having more multimodal data give a richer input, or having things like clinical outcomes rather than just the interpreter observations as the ground truth of whether there was abnormality or a problem in that data, could mean that the machine can learn to see things that humans don't see in that data. But anytime we increase the amount of data linkage, we increase the privacy risk. So trust in how we do these things is going to be really important, which is kind of the intended topic for part 2, but I've spent more time than I thought on part 1. But I should at least make time to thank all the other people that deserve credit for this work. Yuquan Zhu has just completed a PhD and is first author on a lot of the papers that I've shown you there. And got very positive engagement from the other collaborators listed here, so I'm very grateful to them, and many more. The list is much longer than I should try and fit on the slide. So my intention was to go from that. Maybe I'll do a quick version of of part 2, looking at trustworthy modes of clinical translation. I think this kind of relates to the subject for discussion later, so I can leave a lot of my talking points for the discussion then. The scenario we're in there is, I think a common one, that we've developed some kind of tool, and so now we're thinking we need to start a company if we want to get this into clinical use and see the impact of our work. We don't necessarily want to make lots of money, but we need a company, at least just because we need some kind of entity to demonstrate compliance and accountability. And we're not opposed to making money, but when we're thinking about this set of incentives, so we have to ask whether it's the only way to go with a private company. So the thing that's on my mind a lot at the moment is, could a social enterprise be more effective than a profit-led company in achieving impact? So maybe it's good enough to survive in that space, or is it possible that in some ways it's better than a profit-led company for what we want from this space? So formalizing it, the hypothesis is when trust is highly valued, then a social enterprise can outcompete profit-led companies in a free market. And as an add-on to that, that machine learning for healthcare is such a case, such a market where we have that high value on trust. And I'm considering a few different sort of flavors of social enterprise. I won't drill into all of them now, but there's things like B Corps, where it's a certification framework. It talks about how you run your operations. It doesn't constrain you to a particular purpose. Or there are social enterprises, which is not in itself a formal legal term. There are some people who get certified as social enterprises, but the idea is you commit to reinvesting at least 50% of your profit in some expressed community interest. Or you can go harder than that and be a community interest company where you have a legally binding purpose and these extra assurances, an asset lock and a dividend cap that essentially mean that there's a limit on how much of your profits can go to investors, and you are legally prevented from selling your assets off in ways that remove that value from the company that exists to serve your community purpose. So those assets are locked into serving the purpose you've expressed there for. So I'll think about how to do the shorter version of this talk, because there's a lot to consider. I think maybe the most interesting part is coming to some fresh data here. We could talk about models of trust and what are the factors that influence trust in this settings, but there's some relatively fresh data being done coming out of NHS England and their work on understanding from the public what matters about how health data is used and what are the limits of trust here. So they've got a sort of series of consultations going on this, and in their initial consultations they looked at which organizations are trusted, and we see that the NHS is very trusted with research data, and things like companies developing apps, services, or AI to improve services in the settings come out significantly lower, below 30% versus above 70%. And in between, we have things like medical research charities or universities and research institutions. So I think essentially the sort of non-profit space. They haven't asked about things like community interest companies, where it's a company, but where the system of incentives is a bit closer to something up here. My hypothesis is that a community interest company could sort of do this job, but around this level of trust, and therefore be easier to get to market because some of those trust questions are more easily addressed, at least in terms of public perception. Just in the last couple of weeks, they've had a big follow-up consultation, so they've been doing a lot of deliberations with a sample of the public in this space. So this is run by NHS England. Their Cohort 1 report talks about a very relevant case study buried in there. So the public are asked to consider how an AI tool developed by a medical research charity could be used to improve diagnosis and treatment for breast cancer, and then consider the same, but swapping the charity for a startup pharmaceutical company. So again, they're not really considering I think the special case of something like a community interest company that is sort of in between the two of these, that, but we see, we've got a few quotes there, I won't read each one, but their conclusion is that overall participants felt significantly less comfortable with their data being shared with a private pharmaceutical company than with an academic research charity, stemming from a belief that a pharmaceutical company would be more financially motivated, with profits ultimately going to shareholders. So, when it comes to public perception of how we run these services and how we handle the data, the question of profit and where it goes looms very large in terms of what public are concerned about, and therefore perhaps what kind of things in the near future the NHS is going to be more interested in commissioning. So if I can kind of span this difference by creating a community interest company, is that going to make it easier for me to get to market down the line, compared with if I'm taking one of these more extreme approaches? I don't want to set up a charity and run that. It's very heavily regulated, and it's not the kind of work that I would be good at. I think running a more complicated charity, I'm up for some level of regulation, but my focus is on delivering the impact from this research. We could talk a bit more about areas where profit motives get involved in translation, and what aspects of a service might be have the potential for misaligned incentives. It's hard to tell in any particular case when these things are happening, but at least Eric Topol has stuck his neck out for me there and suggested, at least in terms of this interoperability question, that the frustrations that we see in terms of how interoperable tech services in health are, his belief, at least, he suggests that a lot of it is willful, that a profit-led company is disincentivized from giving you all the interoperability that you would want with, because they would rather sell you the whole system, or do the work of integrating things for you. But that's simplifying a lot, and I'm not saying that all of these things are happening all the time, but it's things to think about that might be making a difference. It's hard to say when they do and don't. There are some precedents for social enterprise or community interest companies running services in health. A lot of our NHS services across this region are delivered by a community interest company. My assumption is that a big factor in them winning that contract is that they could be shown to be trustworthy, because it's baked into their constitution with legally binding mechanisms. There are some other cases I could talk about. It's interesting that in care homes, there's evidence to show that actually non-profit care homes can outperform for-profit counterparts in terms of quality and access to those services. I am not aware of any precedent in what I'm now calling health data technologies. Machine learning in general, or machine learning for health, I'm not aware of an example of someone taking a social enterprise approach to that. But I can't see why not. So if you are aware of such an example, please tell me. I think I can skip ahead of this for the sake of getting to the more open discussion. But looking back to my original hypothesis, I think there's a strong case there that it could make a big difference. Whether it works in practice, I'd like to hear what you think, really. Obviously, just having a clear purpose alone is not going to be enough to ensure trustworthiness, that all the same regulatory mechanisms, you still want them to be in place, and you want that entity, part of why it exists is to show that all those regulations and good practice guidelines are being adhered to. I think having this, clarity of, or this alignment of purpose would likely have a positive effect on a lot of informal interactions, lots of things that make the stuff happen, but that aren't, that are hard to measure, the hallway conversations and that kind of thing. Whether it makes a formal difference to any concrete processes, perhaps not. No one wants to bake it into the regulations that only a community interest company can deliver machine learning services for health, because of course the private sector is, can be very effective and is an essential part of how we achieve this vision on the scale that we want to achieve it. So I'm not suggesting that the social enterprise approach could replace all that, but I think maybe it can complement it. But yeah, it might not get baked into concrete processes. We'll see if that changes. In that NHS England consultation, there's talks of things like a data pact, setting up, they're clearly doing some work to set up what is and isn't acceptable in terms of how we use health data. And at least in my biased reading of it, the question of trust and profit motives looms large in the problems that they're wrangling with. So whether they choose to write that into their guidelines or not, we'll see. If they did, I would come out with a very clear yes, that I'm going to set up a social enterprise now to do this. But as it stands, I can see that there are arguments both ways. So I didn't quite have time to put together my own Slido, so I just dumped the Slido question onto the presentation, but this can be something to lead into the discussion. So what should I do next if I want to maximize the impact of that AI for EEG work that I was talking about? Should I start a charity? Should I just start a normal company and take the default approach? Should I look at something like a social enterprise where I say I'll reinvest half my profits into health tech development, or go harder with a community interest company, and so that I can say to people, this is essentially non-profit. Any money that we make from you is going to be reinvested in this cause. Or should I just stop thinking about trying to run a company and stay in academia and just license the technology to someone else who's shown themselves already to be trustworthy in handling data? Because I can't tell Microsoft how to handle data in a secure way. They've got much more practice at that than me. So in some ways, you could argue through their competence, they are more trustworthy than whatever I'm going to try and do. Or should I consider other options? Sorry to rush through that in a slightly less structured way. But yeah, there's a few other talking points there I could come back to if we have time in the broader discussion. Otherwise, I'll end there. Thank you very much for listening.